Good evening, everyone. My name is Marianne Peters, and I'm the CEO of the Carter Center, and it's my pleasure tonight to moderate the conversation called Tunisia, the best hope, actually the only hope, of the Arab Spring. So thank you for being here with us for what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. Personally, I've been looking forward to this because as CEO of the Carter Center, I've had the chance to visit Tunisia a couple of times, including in 2015 as co-leader of our election observation team at the time. And I found it then to be a very special place. I know all of our panelists feel the same, and I'm going to introduce you to them now. On my far right is Sarah Johnson. Sarah is an associate director in our democracy program with deep experience both in Tunisia and around elections. And next to her and next to me is Alexis Arieff, who is with the Congressional Research Service and an Africa policy analyst for them. And on the screen, you see Isen Sbabti, who is a project officer in our office in Tunis. So a special welcome to all. This is the first time we've had a panelist participate virtually, so we're very excited about that. I don't anticipate any technical difficulties, but if there are any, I beg your indulgence in advance. You can learn much more about our distinguished panelists in your programs. Just one more note before we begin tonight's program, and that is, please silence your electronic devices. However, if you want to keep them out and tweet, please do. The hashtag is Carter Center Arab Spring, the nouns capitalized. And you may also use Twitter to submit questions if you're participating virtually. If you're here with us in the audience, as you can see, there are mics on both sides, and you can submit your questions there. But before we go to questions, I want to start the conversation with a video that actually provides some background on the important election that Tunisia held last fall. So let's cue the video.
نهار اليوم معجزة صارت في تونس، معجزة إلهية. الشيء كنا نشوفه فيه في التلفز في الدول الغربية نتعجبوا.
In the fall of 2019, the Carter Center conducted an election observation mission in Tunisia, where citizens got the chance to vote in what were just the second genuinely democratic presidential and parliamentary elections since the country won its independence in the 1950s.
Tunisia has impressively been able to conduct elections that reflect the will of the people. And Tunisia's democracy has withstood the pressures and the very, very strong pressures exerted on it.
دايما متفائلين يعني بحول الله اللي تونس بقدرة ربي باش تتقدم، ما نعرفش أنا إحساسي هذا.
نحس واجب وطني ونساهم في معناها فني باش يشد جديد، نحاول باش نختار اللي باش يشد لنا جديد.
The Carter Center has been working in Tunisia since the 2011 revolution that brought an end to dictatorship and set the country on a democratic path. It deployed a team of more than 90 observers to monitor the elections.
A lot is riding on this. Success in the conduct of the elections and being seen as fair, inclusive, with a high degree of participation and interest on the part of the electorate, I think would go somewhere toward validating what started the spirit of the Arab Spring.
Pour moi, en tant que jeune, je voudrais bien que notre patrie ait de bonnes conditions pour, et qu'elle soit vraiment épanouie par rapport aux autres pays. Et surtout, on vise toujours la démocratie, la liberté, l'honnêteté.
The elections proceeded smoothly, and Tunisians now are hoping their new president and parliament will work together to improve the country's economy and strengthen its democratic institutions.
We tend to say that Tunisia is a success story in the light of what happened after 2011 and what people call the Arab Spring. We should not be satisfied with the bar that Tunisia has reached, even though we should be proud, but we should encourage it to set a bar that is much higher than the one it has actually attained.
So with that as background, let's plunge into the conversation. And the first question I'm going to put to the panelists is, why Tunisia? Why, of all the countries that participated in the first wave of the Arab Spring in 2011, is it that we can only have this discussion tonight about Tunisia? Isen, I'm going to ask you to comment on that first.
Well, first, thank you for having me, and thank you for this question. When it comes to Tunisia, I think most importantly, it's been an outlier here in the region after 2011. Tunisia is a small country. It only has a population of 10 million people. It always has been some kind of a centralized state. It always had the same borders, more or less, for hundreds or if not for thousands of years. And it has this tradition of strong state institutions. It's not built upon a social structure with the influence of tribalism, unlike other neighboring countries, or at least it does not weigh as much as them. And I think the important part is that Tunisia was not only an outlier after 2011, it was an outlier even before. And it was always linked to some kind of a reformist movement that was especially accelerated during the 19th century. It started with the abolition of slavery in 1846, the Fundamental Pact in 1857, and the first constitution of an Arab country in 1861. And these legal frameworks paved the way for this discussion, at least at the elite level, because there was an enlightened elite that was open to foreign influences, and that started the whole discussion of the division of powers, the independence of the justice system, having equality before the law, having a state of law. So this long process that took centuries to go, it really paved the way, and it kind of predisposed the Tunisian society, which, if we would give also another example when it comes to the behavior of the Tunisian people themselves and their openness to new concepts. For example, if you would talk about the Tunisian dialect, which is a variation of the Arabic language, it's based on Arabic. It has Amazigh vocabulary, which is the language of the native people. It has French. It has an increasing amount of English. There's also a significant part of Italian, Spanish, and Turkish vocabulary. So to the point where Arab speakers from other countries wouldn't understand it. This is, I think, one of the important things, the fact that Tunisia was always open to new concepts, and this really helped pave the way for democracy on the longer term.
Thank you very much. So Tunisia was really preparing itself for centuries to succeed after 2011. Sarah, what do you have to add to Isen's insights?
First, thank you for having me as well, and Isen, thank you for your comments. I think it set everything up perfectly for 2011 to happen. And when things first started to happen in Tunisia, Tunisia is a small country. As Isen noted, there's a population of 10 million people. It did not have a very big military, and the military was not willing to repress the people, or repress
unlike Egypt, for instance.
The revolution, unlike Egypt, exactly. And the military reportedly also helped to have Ben Ali leave the country and did not allow him to come back. His intention, or at least the rumor has it, was that his intention was to bring his family to Saudi Arabia and then return, and they wouldn't let him back on the plane. So that was a first turning point. Then the population is quite small. A lot of the elite civil society and politicians knew each other, and they were able to form a consensus as to what an interim authority, who would be that interim authority, and it ended up being around 125 people on a committee to make decisions as to whether or not they were headed into an election for a government or an election for a constituent assembly, and what the electoral laws would be in order to elect that body. And a lot of decisions needed to be made, and they were able to make those decisions in a very consensus way. And then even after the National Constituent Assembly was formed, that's the body that drafted the Constitution, they realized after the elections and accepted the idea that that was the only elected body in the country. And so it essentially took on the role of governing, even though that wasn't foreseen before the election. And so it extended its term by a couple years, and everyone was happy to have that stability and have elected officials that were taking decisions in a democratic way. So all of those things really help to make a very peaceful foundation for the democracy that we're seeing today.
Thank you. And Alexis, what about the rest of the world? Is there something about the rest of the world that helped Tunisia succeed?
I mean, I think that something that Ihsan touched on, Tunisia has been open to outside influences and has been close to Europe, both through trade relations, just proximity, physical proximity. It's extremely close to southern Italy. It has been historically linked to sort of the broader Mediterranean. And then in contemporary life, a lot of Tunisians have lived overseas, have lived in Europe, have come back, have experienced democracy in other places. So there was that aspect of sort of experience with more democratic systems. Also because it is seen as sort of a unique place and a small sort of one-off country within the Middle East region, the great powers in the Middle East that are now competing, Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Turkey, they had interests in Tunisia and they continue to pursue interests, but they didn't intervene there in as blatant or in as violent a way as they have in Libya, for example, in Yemen. So I think in some ways being able to portray itself as an exception helped Tunisia escape some of those very destructive energies.
I think those are all terrific explanations for why Tunisia. But let's delve a little bit deeper. Ihsan, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about your experience. What has changed really in Tunisia in the last now 9 years? Could you tell us how it feels?
Well, I think it did change for the good, but also sometimes it changed sometimes for the bad, and it depends on the perspective. But I think first I will have to go back to the situation before the revolution and to how people were living in a certain climate of fear. It depends on where the people were politicized or not, because people who were not politicized were much more indifferent to the context. But even then, even for example for myself and for younger people who did not really experience the political violence of the older regimes, you would feel that passing by, for example, institutions that symbolize power, as police stations or the presidential palace, for example, you wouldn't feel an ownership of these institutions as part of your country, but you would have some kind of a dissociation between what your country is and what the rulers are. And this is actually something that has really changed after the revolution, because people nowadays feel that these institutions are their own and that they have a saying as to what direction the country goes to and how things should be managed. And people are really trying to hold the responsibles accountable for what they are doing. But it's really important to understand that something as simple as, for example, the internet. Before the revolution, there was a lot of censorship on the internet. For example, even it would reach out to Wikipedia pages about Tunisia. Some pages were not accessible. You would find a 404 error mistake message when you access them. But after the revolution, everything became more open, and people were able to have discussions freely, and this was really helpful for people who were not politicized before. So there was a great improvement of the political culture and of the involvement in the public discussion.
Let me just ask you, going back to how people felt before the revolution when they were near a symbol of state power, like a police station or, as you said, the presidential power, was there a feeling of fear or trepidation, or a feeling that you should just keep your eyes down and scurry past?
Yes, this is actually it, And I think one of the things that haunted people more or the most were the pictures of the president, whom you will find everywhere. in every public institution, or even for us students at that time in our class books. In the history books, for example, everything ends with the coup d'etat of 1987 of the previous president Ben Ali, and we learned not to ask questions about that. So when you see the pictures everywhere, or when you see the symbols of power, you learn to just pass by and continue your path elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Alexis, from your perspective, what's changed in Tunisia over the past 9 years?
There certainly has been this flourishing of political activity and communication and civil society. We've also had a number of institutional milestones. There was the Constitution adopted in 2014, as Sarah mentioned. We've had 2 rounds of full national elections now, including those in 2019, and then preceded by the National Constituent Assembly elections in 2011, so getting into a path of regular, open political competition. That said, probably the quality of government service delivery has deteriorated a little bit. That's a common grievance that people in Tunis and elsewhere cite. And the economy has really suffered, not just because of the transition, but because of global and regional factors that happen to coincide with Tunisia's transition. So when I was there with the Carter Center Election Observation Mission in October, I had a sort of casual conversation with a taxi driver, for example. It's always hazardous to tell taxi driver anecdotes, but I thought this one was still revelatory. The driver was complaining to me about all the things that were going wrong in Tunis, that were difficult. Life is hard. The trash collection has suffered. And I said, well, do you feel that anything has been accomplished since 2011? And he said, well, just freedom. It was kind of amazing, that in a way it's an accomplishment that he could be so casual about this enormous shift, but it says something also.
It really does. I'm glad you decided to use the taxi driver anecdote. Sarah, what do you think has changed in 9 years in Tunisia? It's hard to believe it's been 9 years.
It is hard to believe it's been 9 years, because I remember the first moment that I heard about the revolution and Ben Ali leaving the country. The first time that I visited Tunisia was in 2003, and I was there to help facilitate a conference on women's participation in politics and public affairs. And they literally had guys in black leather jackets and black suits sitting in the lobby of the hotel, noting down who was coming in, walking around the parking lot, noting their license plate numbers. So they'd be walking around the parking lot of the Carter Center, noting down who was here to listen to the conversations. And they followed me everywhere. They followed me to the beach, just to see what I was doing and who I was talking to. And that environment has completely changed. The only thing you could get people to talk about was soccer and the weather. And now, as Alexis said, and Hassan, you can get in a cab and say, what do you think of what's going on at the government negotiations? And the person will definitely give you an earful of what they think. And that is a very significant shift. There's still a lot of things that need to be changed. We have a new constitution, but they need to align the laws of the previous regime with that constitution and be able to know that the laws themselves will protect the rights that are found in the Constitution. So there's still a long way to go on things, but just the shift in general of holding the government more accountable and being able to sincerely elect your leaders has been a huge, monumental shift.
Indeed. But sometimes not.
To speak to women's issues in particular, Tunisia was an outlier in the region on women's socioeconomic rights. Women have the right to divorce. They have long held prominent positions in professional life, even in the security services. Tunisia has a much heralded 1956 personal status code that sort of enshrines a lot of these gender equality, provisions and women's rights that Tunisians are rightly proud of. What's happened since 2011 is that with democratic competition, there has come more women's advocacy. I mean, to the extent that there's more civil society overall, there are also more women's voices. There are more women who have run for, genuinely elected office, not just a non-competitive, government position. And there is a flourishing of sort of women's voices in civil space. On the other hand, some groups, more socially conservative groups, have used new freedoms to push for more conservative visions of what women's role should be. And so we do see the rise of, religiously conservative activists who have either peacefully or sometimes not so peacefully tried to sort of put women in their place in a way that they see fit.
What is the position of the largest party on women's roles?
So the largest party currently in parliament and really sort of consistently since 2011 has been Ennahda, which is an Islamist political party. They actually now call themselves Muslim Democrats, so they don't use the term Islamist. And that says a little bit about their worldview. They are not an arch-conservative party. They have expressed support over time for the personal status code and for maintaining, women's gains as they are. On the other hand, they have resisted some efforts to move further into gender equality. So they did not embrace a proposal under the last government to amend the inheritance law, under which women actually inherit a fixed proportion less than their male siblings when parents pass away. So they can go up to a certain point, and they are certainly not the most conservative voice in society, but there are sort of red lines for their base.
Thank you. Sarah, how do you see women and youth coping with these changes?
Well, as you say, is your microphone working? Can you hear? Okay.
My mic has been working.
Our mic man is coming to help you.
Well, I've already asked my question, so you
Yes, Ambassador Peters was asking what changes that we've seen for women and youth, and I think that there have been lots of changes. The changes have affected different demographic groups differently. Women and youth in particular, we saw a large increase in participation immediately after the revolution, where everyone was very engaged, maybe at an equal level. Many more women and youth got registered to vote and participated in the 2011 Constituent Assembly election. By 2014, even though the voter participation rates were very high and lots of people were registered to vote, the actual turnout rates dropped among women and youth. And as the Carter Center, we wanted to understand a little bit more of this dynamic and why it was that women and youth were participating less. So we started a survey research in collaboration with a Tunisian partner to do focus groups on a grassroots level and to really understand among these targeted women and youth populations as to how they saw the developments, why they were registering but not participating in the end, what their expectations were. And I think our findings were really interesting in that many people who had voted in 2011, and particularly among the youth, said that they felt disappointed by how their elected officials had represented them or actually failed to represent them, and that they didn't want to have the responsibility of having voted someone into office that then would not be representing the public interest. And so rather than vote those people out, they decided to disengage from politics. And after talking more about their role and the role as a citizen and what role you have in voting, they were more likely to express interest in voting and being engaged in the municipal elections that were coming up in 2018. And then And we also helped with our local partner to devise a voter outreach campaign that reached over 10,000 people to try and encourage more youth and women to be engaged and to help reduce the barriers to their participation. So, we did see the turnout again in 2019 was still not as high as before, but it did have a bump for the presidential runoff. And I think that also reflects the amount of interest from youth in thinking that the new in the perception that the new president is a more honest and straightforward person, that he's running for public office for a public interest as opposed to his own personal interests. And the more that the government can do to help show that the government is really there to serve the benefit of the people, I think the more we'll see these groups engage in politics.
There was some good news today that may have validated the faith that people showed in the system in the presidential runoff by voting in somewhat larger numbers. Would you care to talk about that?
I definitely would. I'm very excited to say that they, after 4 months of negotiation, they were finally able to form a government, and today the parliament voted a vote of confidence in the new government. So now we will have a new prime minister and a new government in order to lead the next foreseeable future. They've already announced some of their key priorities, and this government was founded on the ideas of the revolution. So we're hoping that this will be the government that helps issue in a series of reforms, elects judges to the Constitutional Court, and really kickstarts the reforms that are going to be needed on the economic side too.
Inshallah. I realize, of course, that no one speaks for women and no one person speaks for youth, but you obviously are young, and I'd like to hear what you think about the attitudes of people of your generation, both toward the revolution and, in fact, if you'd care to comment, toward this good news of the formation of a government.
Well, I think I'll start by the reaction to the government election. I think people sometimes might be cautiously optimistic, but most youth are a bit skeptical because people are already talking about whether this government is going to last because of the internal differences between the parties that form this coalition. So this is going to be problematic. And also because youth have such distrust of politicians because they have never seen during those last 9 years someone who fulfilled their promises to them and who actually got some achievements. And this is actually very problematic because it's linked to the political culture of this newer generation, which was founded on the revolution itself, which is an act of getting someone out of power. It's not always something constructive as to engaging actively in a party or in civil society or being part of the process. It's about being dissatisfied. So this might have a negative impact on the short and maybe also on the longer term for this generation. And this is something that we currently are observing. So I believe it's going to really need more efforts when it comes to the civic education and providing more opportunities for civic engagement for youth.
Well, I'm glad you said that because the Carter Center does more than elections to build democracy. And in Tunisia, we've been working since 2011 to strengthen democratic institutions. And one of the projects that we have undertaken has to do with youth engagement in the political process. So we're going to stop here for a moment and take a look at a second video about that Carter Center project.
Tajerween is a small Tunisian town that sits about 20 miles from the Algerian border. It has limited economic resources, and its people feel forgotten by the politicians in the bustling capital of Tunis 4 hours away. In 2019, the Carter Center launched a project to help young people in Tajerween and 7 other marginalized municipalities become more engaged in politics, particularly local politics, which is fairly new to Tunisians because they lived under authoritarian rule until 2011.
We held trainings for youth groups in the municipality headquarters and tried to familiarize them with these new concepts of participatory governance and local governance.
And now we have youth that are very active. They were able to learn about what democracy is and how to be a part of it.
It's important for us to understand this process, to be able to express ourselves and to have an impact.
Youth groups developed a project tailored to their community's needs, and the Carter Center provided each with $5,000 to carry out their projects. In Tajerween, youth chose to focus on helping disabled people.
There is 25 police stations that no one of them are accessible of handicap. The idea is to build ramp in schools. Those schools are used as a poll station during the election, so it's a way to encourage disabled people to vote.
The young people of Tajerween hope to make their town a model for other municipalities. They're lobbying their local officials for more funding for the local chapter of a nonprofit that works with the disabled. They also met with town officials to ask them to map existing public buildings that aren't accessible and develop a plan to upgrade them. In 7 other towns in Tunisia, other groups of young people are working to better their communities through a variety of projects. It's a grassroots approach to bolstering democracy.
It's a way to grow up a new generation of youth that could be influenced in local levels, regional level, and national levels long term.
Well, I think we'd like to turn to the future because we started by asking why Tunisia? And if we look at what's happened in the other countries that experienced revolutions, it's not a cheerful prospect, especially, for instance, in Libya, and I think for most of us not in Egypt either. And I think you've heard a few of the challenges that Tunisia faces, and I think we need to delve into that a little bit more. What do you see ahead for Tunisia over the longer term? Will Tunisia be able to sustain and build on this progress in spite of some of the factors and hurdles that the Tunisians face? So I'd like to start with Sarah. I know you have some very strong views on this.
Thank you. The situation is very challenging for Tunisia. I think we touched already on the fact that the economy, the political environment has really flourished, but the economy has gone down since the revolution. And they've had a couple terrorist attacks that have hurt tourism, and that too affects the economy. In a recent poll that I saw, 85% of the respondents said that either they didn't have enough money to meet their basic needs, or they had just enough to cover their basic needs. So really no disposable income whatsoever. And that was really striking to me. 85% is huge. Unemployment is 15% and higher among youth. So in the growing population that is looking for something dynamic to happen and wants to see more what their government is able to do for them, there's a higher percentage of unemployment. So these things are really difficult, and it could really be delegitimizing to a government. If you can't show that you are having an impact to make life better for the people, then it's going to be difficult to really do the structural reforms and both the governance reforms, but also the economic reforms that are needed. So that's really an issue. That's really a difficult thing. And my strong feelings are in the sense that democracy and democracy institution building is a really long-term effort. And this is something that, we might have a new constitution now or new laws, but people really need to have time in order to have faith in them and faith that they're working the way that they're supposed to have the balance of power between those institutions. And we take for granted here in the United States the balance of power between the presidency and Congress and the Supreme Court. And in Tunisia, they're still electing judges to the Supreme Court. It doesn't exist yet. So, there's some big hurdles to overcome. It's still a very positive trajectory, in my opinion, if they can overcome some of the economic challenges.
Thank you. What other challenges besides the considerable challenge of an economy that can't produce enough jobs do you see, Alexis?
I think that's certainly high on people's minds, and linked to that are grievances around corruption and sort of who is perceived to have benefited from the transitional period. There's a lot of bitterness toward the new political class that sort of turned some of the old systems around in their benefit or created new ways of profiting from political activity. Or in some cases, these are also old regime figures who survived into the current political era by repositioning themselves. There's also the security situation, which domestically has improved hugely since a series of large attacks by Islamic State-affiliated groups, mostly planned from Libya in 2015, 2016. There have been small attacks since then, but nothing quite so large and nothing as devastating to the tourism industry. So that seems to be a good news story, but obviously as long as the war lasts in Libya and we don't see much end in sight there, that's going to be a persistent challenge for Tunisian officials and security forces. And insecurity can really undermine people's faith in government as well, in the same way that a lack of economic benefits can.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Tunisia is in fact the best hope of the Arab Spring, but because it is the best and only hope, it's suffering from this kind of security threat from Libya and from elsewhere in what's a pretty dangerous neighborhood. Ihsan, what do you see are as the big challenges for the future of your country, and what will decide whether in another 9 years we'll be here once again celebrating the progress of Tunisia?
Well, I think mainly it's going to be the economic challenge, because as everyone has said previously, it's been going backwards for the last few years. And I think part of the responsibility now lies in the hands of the political parties that if you go back to the bigger picture, they might not have been that experienced in managing state affairs because of the pre-2011 situation. But now they have to improve their capacities when it comes to the policy formulation and the policy implementation, and understand that we are in a context of long-term reforms, not in a transitional period. Because right now, for most parties, I believe, they focus on not creating newer conflicts, or they want to please everyone to the point where they wouldn't undertake what we call here the painful reforms. So for example, and I would want to cite the example of the privatization. In a with a big deficit in the finances, and especially in the publicly owned companies, privatization is an option that I'm not really happy with. But if you are against privatization, not because you have an alternative or you have a strategic long-term plan, but it's just because you don't want to cause conflicts with unions that would cause you problems for your own, this is not a solution. And I think political parties need to work more also on their structures, because for the last couple of electoral cycles, we always end up having new parties created, new parties that are dying, and this has created a lot of instability that has made it more difficult to undertake those economic reforms.
Going back to the question, the always difficult question of privatization, can you give us some examples of some publicly held enterprises that are presumably inefficient but are still allowed to continue?
Like, for example, nowadays, the state has a monopoly on tobacco, which is in some way problematic if you are funding something that is not really in the public interest. But also, the transportation companies, for example, are not really that efficient. And there should be programs on how to better govern them, better manage them, make them a source of benefits for the national budget and not a liability. And this is a discussion that we should have been having. But everyone has been pushing forward this status quo situation because no one really wants to undertake reforms that could be that could have a social or a political cost, especially. And this is problematic.
Well, I do have to say that privatization has been done badly in many cases, for instance, in Russia. So some caution might be called for. I'm going to put you on the spot one more time, Sen, and say, if you could wish for this government to do one thing in the next year, what would it be?
Education reform.
Can you talk a little about that?
Yes. Well, for the educational system right now, especially if we link to the whole civic engagement issue and the civic education, our system is not really helpful right now because people are not really involved in discussions in any way. And people in the classroom nowadays are just in a passive situation, receiving some kind of information that is not really up to date. And this is really problematic, especially if we link it to the challenges that we are facing right now. And to, for example, problems, and I really want to cite the example, for example, of climate change, because this year has been really difficult for Tunisia when it comes to the water resources, because there's some kind of drought. But we are not really talking about this issue because people are not aware of this problem. And this is maybe something that we could achieve if we focus more on this reform of education.
Thank you. Alexis, is there something that the United States or other outside actors who want to support Tunisia should be doing that they're not doing?
That's a good question. So, I mean, just to talk a little bit about what the U.S. has done since 2011, the United States now provides about 10 times annually the foreign aid to Tunisia that it did prior to 2011. Now, that was a very low base, it was less than $10 million to begin with. So actually, in the last 2 years, we're almost at 20 times that. It was $191 million in bilateral aid last year.
Which is quite a bit for a country of 10 million people.
It's quite a bit for a small country. It's quite a bit for Tunisia historically. On the other hand, it's small potatoes in the Near East region. So Egypt and Jordan get many times that amount of money. Israel gets many times that much money. But still, for Tunisia, that's a lot. And that assistance has gone toward a wide range of programs. Obviously, some of the programs of the Carter Center have received U.S. funding on the democracy promotion side. There's some economic reforms assistance. There's capacity building for civil society groups. And then some of it is military aid and counterterrorism assistance that's seen as stabilizing, in particular after the 2015-2016 incidents, and sort of conventional military assistance as well. Police reform has also been an aim. So there is kind of a multifaceted, set of activities that the U.S. is supporting. I would say one area of contention has been related to some of these economic structural reforms has been the International Monetary Fund's negotiation with Tunisia about the types and pace of fiscal and structural reforms to cut back on Tunisia's fiscal deficits. And that has been controversial in Tunisia. There have been protests, and one could argue that at a time when a new political system is struggling to gain traction and public buy-in, it's a difficult time to be implementing a fiscal austerity program, especially when sort of regional conditions are what they are. So that's something that, it's hard for me to have a view on it, but it's definitely something that's been debated in Washington and in Tunis.
Well, and it's also hard when clearly economic growth is needed to underpin the democratic the democratic reforms. But it is always a tough conversation. Sarah, I'm going to give you the last word, at least until we get some questions about what specific things you would like to see take place in Tunisia in the near term to set the stage for the long term. And yes, I think we heard you say we all have to be patient because it is going to take time.
It really does take a long time, and I would like to even think that it's hopefully, across the region, not the only hope for the Arab Spring, and that it's really just because it's a long-term thing that other countries will follow suit. I'm going to be optimistic, glass half full on that. But in Tunisia, I think I'll reinforcing the institutions, the democratic institutions that they've started to build in terms of the judiciary, reinforcing the powers of the parliament. I think this new parliament has an opportunity really to enforce, well, first of all, to create the constitutional court and elect the judges, but also to reestablish itself as the key institution that drafts legislation and passes legislation. The former parliament that we just had ended up reviewing and passing a lot of legislation that the government had drafted and that the presidency had drafted. So I think they're building and strengthening those institutions is going to provide the foundation for the long-term success of Tunisia.
I actually am going to ask one more quick question. And I didn't warn the panelists of this one, but are there forces out there that don't want Tunisia to succeed? Alexis, you first.
That's a doozy to throw in at the end. I think we can assume that other authoritarian governments in the region are not wild about the idea of a Tunisia success story, and that goes for countries further afield, maybe some speculatively in the Gulf, but also, there's even an interesting situation next door in Algeria where there's been a large protest movement over the last year calling for deeper political change, sort of modeled almost after the Arab Spring uprisings, but trying to learn some of the lessons of the countries that didn't go well. And so I can imagine that there are people in Algeria who see Tunisia as a potential way forward, and there must also be forces in Algeria that wish that Tunisia didn't serve as that example.
Very well parried, thank you. Do you have anything to add, Sarah?
I would extend that further west to Morocco as well, because they have made incremental changes and introduced incremental changes and some constitutional reforms. But there's been demonstrations in Morocco over the last year as well, and from a very similar starting point as Mohammed, the fruit vendor in Tunisia. In the case of Morocco, it was a fishmonger who had the police throw away his fish, and he ended up trying to climb into a garbage truck to recover them and was crushed by the garbage truck. And that spurred lots of demonstrations over the last year. So I would extend that further west. But I think that there are many more countries, at least in Europe and the West, that are rooting for Tunisia to succeed. And among them, the European countries that are looking at this migration crisis that's coming through North Africa, and seeing that if North Africa is more stable, then it will be a benefit to them as well.
Thank you. Ihsan, do you care to comment?
Well, I just wanted to say that I think whatever the foreign response or foreign factors are, I think the most important thing is to have a robust domestic political process. And I believe that we have been in the right path for the last 9 years, and I'm really hopeful that in the future you will be holding another conference maybe about further successes.
Thank you. That's a great note on which to end the panel comments. So I'd like, first of all, to thank our panelists for their insightful perspectives. And now I'd like to invite questions. Please find your way to one of the mics up the steps. And how do we get the tweeted questions, if there are any? Okay. So please make your way to a mic if you have a question. Sir.
I'll get it rolling if I can. I'll ask two questions. You talked about the apathy or reticence amongst the youth to accept the change and be able to acknowledge that such change takes time. Am I fair in interpreting your comments as there is a potential for a rollback here?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a potential for a rollback as much as stagnation. But I think that Ihsan actually touched on something very similar in the sense of that the revolution itself was something of people expressing their dissatisfaction and kicking someone out of power, rather than being supportive of a political process that then would be successful, working things through a political process, and whether or not the younger population and younger generation is ready to engage on that level. And that actually, I would maybe throw that question out to Ihsan to give an answer, because you know much better than I do.
I think it's going to take some time before the next generation would become more engaged. But I believe during those next 5 years, it's going to be decisive, because more younger people voted during the second presidential runoff. So they had this time higher expectations than the previous times, and they registered in higher numbers. And whether with this term of office, whether they will be satisfied or dissatisfied, I believe that they're going to have a reaction, and they're going to link it to their first choice. So either they're going to vote for someone else or contribute with anything, at least they are going to have a reaction. They are going to be part of the process. And it's going to be incremental, and it's going to take some time, but it's coming.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Alexis? Okay. So, ma'am, over here.
Thank you, and thank you, Ihsan. I know it's a bit late there. I wanted to ask what efforts are being made, if any, at this time to kind of stem what people are saying there's a brain drain on some of the skilled youth in Tunisia, and also maybe to bring back some of the people who have left, who can contribute a lot of the skills that are necessary in building this robust process and institutions. Thanks.
Ihsan, what about the brain drain? Is there one?
Yes, I think it's been becoming pretty tragic and dramatic lately. Like at the point where you would have, like, I would have personally to go to the airport every month to say goodbye to a friend who's leaving, especially lately for the younger doctors who are going to Germany and things like that. But I'm not really sure whether there's a policy, an organized policy that is trying to help them reconnect and come back and find opportunities. I think it's linked to the bigger economic situation, to the point where it's going to take another direction. People might want to come back again. So there's the potential, at least.
Any comment, Alexis or Sarah?
I would note that it's been a problem for Tunisia for a long time. In a way, it's also, though, a strength. You have people who move abroad, who get professional experience abroad, and who could potentially, hopefully, at some point, bring that back home.
If there are opportunities for them back home. Thank you. Good question. Yes. Oh, sure.
Sorry, thank you. I'm wondering about the influence of China, if there is one, in Tunisia. For those who, I live portions of the year in China, and China's, as you all I'm sure know, is tossing money by the bucket loads into the continent, some of it with a lot of hooks attached. But I'm also aware that what we call the Jasmine Resolution in China, scared the living daylights out of that government. So that made me wonder, because there was no mention of any Chinese money in Tunisia, if in fact they are actively not investing in Tunisia because of the success of the Arab Spring, and if that's the case.
There is Chinese investment and cooperation with Tunisia, including in the context of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So as a coastal country in the Mediterranean, that's one focus region for the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's kind of global infrastructure linkage effort. And that does come along with some troubling aspects of cooperation. There have been some discussions about technology transfer that, for example, for surveillance or other purposes, it raises some red flags. I wouldn't say that Tunisia is necessarily the absolute focus of China in that region, but it has certainly become of interest for them, notwithstanding whatever their leadership might have thought of the 2011 uprising. Well, it includes some infrastructure construction and so forth. So yes, that can contribute to economic growth.
Ma'am.
A bit of a three-part question. So Sarah, you mentioned that the Parliament discussed some legislative agendas. I'd like to know what they're thinking about in terms of priority. Secondly, you also mentioned that there wasn't a constitutional court yet, but there was election of Supreme Court justices. So what will it take to actually establish a constitutional court? And then thirdly, I wanted to know what the long and short-term goals are of the Carter Center in the area post-2019 elections.
Your questions are all, it's a three-part question, but it's all wrapped up into one, actually. So the Constitutional Court has certain members who are selected by the president, other members that are selected by the judiciary, and others that are appointed by or elected by the parliament. So in order for the president to appoint his members, the parliament has to elect their members, and the last parliament had a difficulty in reaching the 143 votes that they needed in order to agree and elect members, or elect the judges. This will actually be one of the speaker's first priorities. He talked about that with the announcement of the government passage. And I think that really is one of the important things to do. There's been an interim authority that can consider the constitutionality of laws, but it doesn't consider the greater constitutional questions and interpreting the Constitution itself. So for example, last July, the president died, and it was supposed to be the Constitutional Court that recognized the speaker as an interim president, and there was no court to recognize him. And as per what we're now experiencing as the usual, the Tunisians did come together to have a consensus very quickly on the fact that the speaker should take over as interim president until the new elections. They did that outside of what the Constitution called for, and kind of avoided a constitutional crisis that in other countries and other contexts could have been very problematic. So that's one of the most important things, and that is one of the things that the speaker, Rashid Ghannouchi, has said that he will prioritize in the new parliament. The Carter Center is still engaged. We still have a team on the ground, and our team right now is focusing on the lessons learned from the elections. We're developing recommendations and working with the Election Commission, the Audiovisual Commission, and the court system to talk about our recommendations for future election and political reforms. And we'll be continuing on with that project. And then we also have a project right now looking at women's participation and their participation not only in politics and voting and elections, but also we're hoping now the next phase of research will focus on their participation in public affairs and associational life, like NGO, civil society life. So those are two of the aspects. The third project that we have running right now that is actually supporting a local organization that is the branch of Transparency International. And they will be doing an online social media monitoring of the government's progress and what ministers are promising and whether or not they're following through with their promises. So we have a very exciting program coming up, and I'm very happy that we do have a new government now, because that means that we won't have new elections again. There was a threat of elections, and I know that everyone likes to go on an election observation mission, but it's time now for the government to get to work. So,
terrific, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Sorry. I think something was said earlier, Hassan, that when the revolution was happening, there was a lot of distrust by the youth of the government. And this past December marks a year since the start of the revolution in Sudan, and there was a lot of distrust, of course, with the youth in Sudan, because all they've known is this a dictator that has ruled for 30 plus years. So my question is, what similarities, if any, if you can compare between the revolution in Tunisia and the revolution in Sudan?
Yeah, that's a very good question. President Bashir in Sudan definitely had a hold on power for a long time, and the National Security and Intelligence Services, the NIS, really kept a pretty tight clamp on things in Sudan. And it was maybe somewhat similar to what the Ministry of the Interior was in Tunisia, but even maybe more pervasive. I think there are certain similarities in terms of the overall general peacefulness of it. There were definitely deaths in Sudan, but not on the scale that we see, the civil war that we saw in Libya, for example. But now the transitional authorities in Sudan include both people from the military and people from the civilian side. And that is a key difference in terms of the Tunisian experience, where it really became a much more civilian-led, or it was only civilian-led in terms of the transition. Sudan also has a longer transition period that they've established before they're going to have elections. In Tunisia, they had the revolution in December, but then by March, they were already talking about elections. They were going to have them in the summer, and then they got pushed to the fall. So the first elections were in October of 2011 for the Constituent Assembly. And so, and they chose to have a Constituent Assembly election to have a body to draft a constitution first. So, that was a relatively quick timeline. In Sudan, you'd be dealing with some of the same issues that you had in Tunisia in terms of being able to organize an election with a voter, maybe needing a new voter roll, and a new electoral framework or a new election law in order to hold a credible election, and a new election body, a new election commission. But they're on a little bit longer of a time frame. And it worries me a little bit that that's a longer of a time frame in a government where you've got both the military and the civilian, and there's clearly interests on both sides as to who holds the most power there and how quickly things happen.
I might add that there are large parts of Sudan where the control of a territory is contested by armed groups, which is not the case in Tunisia, happily. Anything else to add on that topic?
I think there's an interesting parallel that you hinted at, which is, if you go back to 2011 and how Tunisians talked about the early days of protests, even before it was clear that they would lead to an actual change in government, people talked about having broken the wall of fear. That authoritarian systems succeed not just through physical repression, but through convincing everyone that they face unimaginable risk if they step out of line. And if anything, Sudan is that multiplied, right? We're talking about a government that has aerially bombarded its own citizens for decades. So in Tunisia, it's not to understate the level of fear and repression that existed in Tunisia, but in Sudan, it's really extraordinary, that people were able to come together and break that same wall.
Thank you. In order to get the maximum number of questions, we're going to move on. Yes, ma'am.
I also have sort of a multi-part question, so trying to tease my questions apart, sorry if this is lengthy. But you spoke a little bit about privatization of the economy, educational reform, retaining the workforce. I'm wondering what else will boost the economy of Tunisia and help work for prosperity. It sort of seems like democracy plus economic prosperity are like the golden, what you want to aim for. And I guess I also just asking this question of myself, is that enough to be influential to oil-rich countries that are not, based on democracy? Is that convincing enough, even if they did sort of gain this economic momentum? And then you maybe addressed this a little bit, but just again, a reiteration, what are sort of next steps of the Carter Center program and working there? So,
well, for your first question, let's go to Isen, talking about what it's going to take on the brain drain and what could turn the economy around.
I think the most important part is the need for someone to actually do the thinking, the strategizing, because I think due to the political instability and I think it was only a couple of years now that we've had, after the revolution, each year we've had a new government. During the end of the year, you would expect the government to fall and for us to have new governments with new ministers, and then the new ministers have to learn more about each and every challenge. But then by the time that they get used to those positions and by the time they understand what the priorities are or what they are supposed to do, they end up being ousted out of office because of a political crisis or something else. So we really need to have some kind of a political stability for it to sustain some kind of a process of reform that should focus on a longer term strategy. Because if you would just focus on what we call buying the justice security, which is mainly just increasing, for example, the wages, but then it would increase inflation, but then at the same time you didn't, for example, reform the process by which, for example, the food production is being it arrives to the users, because there's a lot of monopolies, there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of mismanagement, and you really need to find the stability for you to be able to have those reforms. And I can't really list certain types of reforms or priorities, because everything needs reforms, to be honest.
Thank you. I don't know if either of our other panelists would like to address the second question, which I understood was, if Tunisia can get both the democratic and the economic reforms right, will that serve as an example to some of the oil-rich but more authoritarian countries? I don't know if either of you would like to take that.
I think looking across the region, you also have Algeria right next door that does have a fair amount of natural resources. They supply most of the natural gas to Spain. They've got oil resources, and in recent years with the drop in when the cost of oil, of a barrel of oil was high, they were riding pretty high. When it went down, they were under a big economic crunch. I think even as a country with large oil resources, you still have to meet the government, you have to meet expectations of the population. And at a certain point when Tunisia had its revolution, Algeria started offering interest-free student loans that didn't need to be repaid to a lot of young people so that they wouldn't be out in the streets. demonstrating. And now they're in the position where they really can't, the government couldn't sustain that, and their economy was declining and their financial reserves were declining. So even an oil-rich country or a resource-rich country can still experience problems, and it might, it definitely serves as an example to the population. It might not serve as an example to the government, but the population definitely takes its lessons.
Thank you. I think we have 3 questioners left, and what I think I'd like to do is have each of you, 2 on this side and 1 over here, come to the mic and ask your question, just one part, please. And then we'll let the panelists respond to all the questions together. So we'll start over here.
Sure. Hi. My question is pertaining to the role of arts and culture in both creating kind of the mindset that is required to invest in a democracy, but also how the arts and culture of maybe diaspora Tunisia comes into creating this imagination of how we're going to get to the democracy that we want.
Interesting question. Thank you. Sir.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yasser. Azam Ahsan. So I just wanted to ask about what the Carter Center is doing in terms of sustainability for the grassroots projects that they're doing, and if they're thinking about sustainability, what it is exactly, and especially maybe what is the relationship with the government.
Okay, so we have arts and culture, sustainability, and you have the last question.
First, I just want to say thank you for all the information you've given us about Tunisia. My question is, I don't know much about Tunisia, so this is a question that I'm hoping that you can answer for me, and if you talked about before, maybe you can just elaborate a little bit. The revolution, was it the workers, was it farmers, are there any unions in Tunisia, and how did the revolution really come up? I know that there's usually one thing, or then there's explosions, so if you can just give me a little bit of information on that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Who wants to take the first question on the role of the arts and culture? Everybody's looking at you, Isan.
Yeah, I can maybe a couple of things. Well, I would start by saying that the revolution has really freed a lot the arts, the artistic elite, arts, especially when it comes to the cinema. There has been an explosion of the cinematic productions after the revolution, talking about the hopes and dreams and fears of the Tunisian people, linked to the political crises, linked to the reforms, linked to everything, to the religion versus modernity question and things like that. And a lot of those artists were actually, for example, coming back from Europe, or were, for example, they have binationality. And yes, I don't know if this helps with the question, but I'm not really that aware of the situation. And I don't know if I could also jump to the third question.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, so just about the revolution, it actually started mainly with a street vendor in a central town that was really marginalized. A street vendor was kind of arrested by the police, and he was humiliated, so he set himself on fire, and this was the incident that made people go out in the streets, mainly youth and unemployed people in those marginalized areas. But then the movement was picked up by the unions, and unions in Tunisia are a really big thing, are really strong. It's actually one of the oldest unions, the oldest union in the region, and it really played a role in channeling these voices from the internal regions to the much bigger cities, to the point where it reached the capital. And this is the point where it led to the actual breaking point of the regime, the 14th of January. It started on the 17th of December 2010 and finished with Ben Ali leaving the country on the 14th of January 2011.
Thank you very
much.
much.
So it was an accumulation.
Thank you. I think you've answered 2 of the 3 questions. I'm going to turn to Sarah for the question on the sustainability of Carter Center programs, and then Alexis, I'll ask if you have any final thoughts.
Sure. Well, a lot of our work around the elections, in the inter-election inter-period and in the preparation for elections, we've also partnered with local organizations. First, to provide training in election observation and our methodology, and to help the local organizations themselves conduct citizen observation work so that they could themselves assess the electoral process and speak publicly about the problems that they saw and the concerns and good things. We've also, on the work that I talked about previously about the focus groups and survey research, the organization that we worked with, the Tunisian organization with whom we worked, we trained several people to be facilitators and moderators of focus groups so that some of those people are actively working in survey research and are able to conduct their own research on different issues so that they can continue work around issue-related campaigns. And the work that we're doing to support, I watched the Transparency International chapter in Tunisia. That too has been helping them to develop their methodology and how to do social media research and social media monitoring. So we're really trying to bring a lot of tools and training techniques and helping our partners learn from us some of the tools that we use in our work, so that those organizations can go off and do that independently of us. But we also learn a lot from them in terms of the local context, how things are working. I would never be able to go and moderate a focus group in Tunisia. I speak French, but I would not be able to do moderated discussion in Tunisian Arabic. So we gain a lot mutually from those partnerships.
Thank you. Alexis, any final thoughts?
Just a few, fleshing out a little bit the point on arts and culture. I mean, one thing that struck me being in Tunisia soon after the revolution in 2011 and even watching it from afar on social media was the use of graffiti and other street art. We saw this in Sudan as well during the protest movement, but it seemed like that played some kind of ineffable role in encouraging people and making them feel like they were able to express themselves, and then sort of mobilizing people through sort of aesthetic inspiration almost. And then to add a little bit on the point about union mobilization, I mean, absolutely the unions played a crucial role in channeling and mobilizing people during the 2011 protests. There had been, in retrospect, union protests in the interior several years earlier that had been harshly repressed, and in a way can be seen now as a trial run for some of the mobilization tactics that were used in 2011. What happened once the protests made it to the capital was that kind of interior working class, socioeconomically driven, but also politically motivated movement met with a very digitally literate, sophisticated set of youth activists, right, who figured out how to publicize what was happening for the international community, who figured out how to marry that agenda with a political change message, that it wasn't enough to just satisfy certain demands, but actually the whole regime had to go. And that was a very interesting thing to watch. Of course, in some ways, that's what we see today, is that this was a dual protest movement, and some of those aims and aspirations have been met, but actually the sort of socioeconomic interior neglect aspirations have arguably not really been met. And so whether Tunisia is a full success story today can be debated even within Tunisia.
And that's a great note on which to end our discussion. I'm afraid that is all the time we have tonight. I hope you'll watch or come and hear our next conversation on April 23rd, which will be on the topic of digital threats to democracy, and there are a lot of them. You'll find more details online. And for right now, please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists once again.